Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Bienvenue aux séries 2022 des sessions virtuelles du CPC. Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you're joining from, and welcome to the Symposium on Federal Budget 2022. In today's session, which is in three parts, you will hear from various experts from different sectors as well as, and also from different parts of the country, private sector, non-for-profit, and universities. The first session is about the presentation of a comprehensive analysis of the budget, which we will get into. But before anything, I want to acknowledge the land that I'm talking to you. I'm talking from Richmond Hill, Ontario, which is a traditional land of the Venda, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe people, whose presence continue to this day. Today's session will be in one Zoom room, so you don't have to change. And the first session is from now until around 1:15, depending on how many questions we have. Then we take a pause and we'll back to the same Zoom room for academic session. The academic session will be presented by Dr. Charmaine Dean, Dr. Malcolm Campbell, and Dr. Baljit Singh, and will be moderated by Eliane Obalijoro, Dr. Eliane Obalijoro from Future Earth Canada. And the second session, which will begin at 3 o'clock after a half an hour pause between 2:30 to 3, and will feature Mark Agnew, Senior Vice President from Chamber of Commerce, Karen Humberg, Member of Industry Strategy Council, Karima Saber, CEO of Quark Venture, and Norma Kuzhaya, Vice President, Research and Economist of Conseil de Partenaires du Québec. And also will be moderated by Kate Murray, President and CEO of Stem Cell Research. We'll get into those bios later on. But before anything, I want to remind you that you can use the chat box to ask your questions when we get into that. The first session, as the tradition in the past few years, we have been enjoying by the comprehensive presentation by Dave Waters and Omer Kaya, who are here with us today. And at this point, I must say one housekeeping note that Dave Waters felt very sick yesterday, but we are fortunate enough to have him back healthier than yesterday and can participate in the presentation. Welcome to both of you, Dave and Omer. Just a brief bio. They are not a stranger to this crowd, but for the just introduction, as you all know, Dave Waters has been the Assistant Deputy Minister in various federal departments. He's an economist by training, and he established Global Advantage Consulting firm very many years ago, and doing a fantastic job in terms of the navigating science and innovation ecosystem. And Omer Kaya, and a younger member of the team, he is now the Chief Executive Officer at the Global Advantage Consulting Group, and he has over 4 years of experience in managing the firm, and previously worked in the academia, holding teacher research positions and private sector as well. He holds a Master of Arts from Faculty of Public Affairs at Carleton University. Without any further ado, I want to turn into, I think Omer or Dave is going to start. I was going to please over to you, and I know that you will exchange during that time. Thank you so very much, and over to you, Omer.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to some of us who may be joining from the western part of our country. Today, we will be talking about the budget, as Meredith introduced. So I will start by sharing the screen right away. I just want to thank you, first of all, for the opportunity, Meredith and CSPC, for this great event. And I'm the CEO of Global Advantage, but the way I see sort of how it got to this level is totally by luck. We have a great team behind this fantastic work, and each one of our team members could absolutely do what I'm trying to do here. And I think from a Canadian sort of economy perspective as well, I feel that luck has been one of the roles of our wealth, as much as the hard work that we have in place. And one of the things that we see in the budget is really that the competitive global context that is really taking up more attention, and the geopolitical context around it as well. So the work that we have done here is informed by our senior advisory group as well, besides the analysis and visualization team. And the topic is decoding the budget for science and innovation. So I'll just dive straight into the agenda for today. We will first look at the budget 2022 context, and then looking at the Canadian research, development, and innovation ecosystem performance, and then key initiatives and investments of the budget in this realm, impacting the government's all levels, looking at the higher education sector, looking at the private sector and global markets. So we'll delve into that at some level of detail, and then results, issues, and broader implications of that, especially also in the global sort of context. And we will offer some suggestions as well going forward. And the purpose of this presentation is to share insights and knowledge that we think we have accumulated looking at this file very closely, and spur a discussion for our ecosystem to work together. Bottom line up front, Budget 2022 proposes 209 new measures. According to our count, key focuses are really there's housing, affordability, climate change, productivity and innovation, defense and health are also the primary foci of the budget. One of the key themes that emerge from this sort of primary foci is really the investments into the clean growth area. This seems to be the dominant issue, emphasizing both the importance of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, but also attracting investments to spur that clean growth going forward. Building collaborations, we think will be very important in terms of looking at the federal government as a whole, working together on the R&D innovation file through permanent collaborative structures with the private sector, especially to be able to respond continuously to the speed of change and emerging risks and opportunities. So that's, I think, going to be very important going forward. Integration of the services for implementation of the budget will also be critical going forward, both in terms of coordinating and integrating hundreds of programs and services that different departments, agencies, and federally funded not-for-profits as well, providing to the ecosystem. For the implementation part, just to note that the budget contains a lot of directions and sort of policy orientation and investments, but they are just words and numbers, and it doesn't include any processes, activities, and schedules. So I think that's also going to be very important in terms of implementation of that going forward. Now over to you, Dave.
Great. Thank you very much, Omer. And it's a pleasure to be healthy enough to be here, and looking forward to a good discussion and questions. Once a budget is finished, this one being about 280 pages, the fundamental question is, well, what's the budget about? And for us, in terms of the analysis, it really comes down to one simple answer: clean growth. But there's really a bit of a conundrum when you look at that concept of clean growth, because what it implies is reducing something and actually growing something simultaneously. So here we have a budget which is one of the main centerpieces is on reducing GHG emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030. And just to remind you, that's only 8 years from now. And the context is we have not reduced emissions fundamentally over the past 30 years. So, talk about a challenging target. And the second is to simultaneously do this while growing the economy. So obviously a very significant challenge. And then you add to that the context that we're now living in a much more hostile and competitive world. I think the events in Ukraine and the Russian invasion have really transformed some of our thinking about the nature of geopolitical events. They've certainly had an impact in terms of energy and energy prices, and also in terms of inflation. So when you look at, again, these two objectives of clean growth, GHG emissions really have to be set within that global context, whereas growing the economy is much more centered on what do we need to do domestically to be able to grow it. When you look at this particular schema that we've got here, this picture, you see a little person down at the bottom of a whole set of stairs. And this is called Canada's first steps towards clean growth. I think the challenge that we see is that, and Omer alluded to this, I think, very, very effectively, this particular person really centers on the public service and the public service today that have got to help us and guide us towards the clean growth objectives. They've been working extraordinarily hard, mostly from home, dealing with COVID-19. They have not known whether their kids are going to be able to go to school, whether they're going to have to wear masks, whether they're going to have to be teaching them at home. And many of them are burned out. Not only now do they have to deliver their A-based programs, but with the mandate letters that were issued to all ministers just recently, they have 645 new commitments that they have to deliver. In addition, in terms of the expenditure reduction plan, there are 104 commitments that are identified there. And then, as Omer just mentioned, there are 209 commitments in this budget. So part of the issue is this little guy is overburdened, is probably partially burned out and stressed. How are they going to be able to take on board all of these activities and deliver them effectively, working with partners in the private sector, not-for-profit sector, and Indigenous communities? Quite a challenge. Next slide, Omer. This is a depiction in terms of the fundamental kind of issue in looking at the concept of clean growth. You have a train tracks here, and you have a locomotive coming down very, very fast. The locomotive, in my view, is really the urgency in terms of meeting our GHG reduction commitments. And I mentioned the initial requirement by legislation to meet these requirements by 2030. You have, going up the tracks, economic growth, the horse. And so many people look at these as being in conflict. Well, how can you grow the economy, at the same time as you've got to reduce greenhouse gases? If you just focus on greenhouse gases, this is going to be at the expense of growing the economy. The issue that our analysis led us to is, well, what if the horse is on the train? Or even what if the horse is driving the train? In other words, what if you made the achieving net zero emissions as part of the fundamental core of driving your industrial growth and your economic activity? So it's not something that is in opposition to it, but make it central. Look at the markets that you might be able to capture, the global markets in terms of clean technologies. Look at the decarbonization of value chains and how this can give your major economic sectors a bit of a comparative advantage. What if we actually embraced net zero emission reductions and made it a centerpiece in terms of driving economic growth? So that's one of the hypotheses that we want to put forward. Next slide, please, Omer. One of the really interesting things I found in terms of looking at Minister Freeland's budget speech was this transition from what I call sunny ways to realpolitik. I've only taken a few of the statements from our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance here, but it revealed a language that I've never, ever seen before in any budget speech. Russia's become an economic pariah, talking about the mutilated people of Bucha. Putin and his henchmen are war criminals. Peace is guaranteed only by your readiness to fight for it. We've been shaken out of our 21st century malaise. And then as she closed her speech and addressed the House of Commons, she said, there's no greater priority for everyone in this House than to build a country that would all be willing to fight for. Now, this is a remarkable toughness in the language that she's using. There's a realism to it. There is a competitiveness to it, and also a sense of urgency. One of the questions then is, will this tone further show itself in terms of the approach in other parts of the budget? And our answer is we think it has. Next slide. Here we have the fact of the way that I kind of depict it is you have a new sheriff in town, Minister Freeland. I mean, this is the first budget in which she hasn't had to deal solely with COVID-19, so she could begin to look at some of the broader economic initiatives. She also has her new deputies as a sheriff. She has Michael Sabia as the deputy minister, Dan Bresnitz, who's the visiting economist, and a new senior assistant deputy minister, Glenn Purvis. One of the things to notice is that Glenn is actually replacing an individual who had been in that position for an extraordinarily long period of time. So you have, even at that key level, a very fundamental change in how you may look at economic growth, and then the particular subset of it in terms of research and development and innovation. Now, in terms of this group of people for the areas of the budget that we have a particular interest in, it's interesting to note that they're looking at building new structures outside of government, not inside. So the $15 billion Canada Growth Fund is going to be independent from government. In effect, it's going to be like a green bank. It's going to be able to take equity positions, look at loan guarantees, looking at a range of grant and other financial instruments and contracts. The $1 billion innovation agency, again, is going to be independent of government, led by the business sector. And the two models that it's going to be patterned after, according to the budget, are Teke's Business Finland and the Israeli Innovation Authority that have some very, very interesting, tougher measures in terms of their capabilities to take equity shares in investments that they make. And the third one is this new permanent Council of Economic Advisors. So again, it's setting up a body outside of government to advise the government on how it should deal with and get some different ideas in terms of achieving economic growth. So very, very interesting changes in the budget. The second area is this initiation of review of program performance. So for those of you who are old enough like myself and were inside government, we went through rounds and rounds of successive fundamental program review cuts. And again, you have the initiation of these with a very large target to find $9 billion federal program costs. The other element here is that related to it is, and that number should be 10.6 million for ISED, to review the effectiveness of federally funded R&D. And this is almost a direct quote from the budget. Does knowledge created at post-secondary institutions generate commercial outcomes? What's interesting in terms of this particular initiative is it's not done just using the normal resources you might have in the federal department. They have an amount of money, 10.6 million, that has been added to their budget, and I believe it's 2 million ongoing. So it becomes a permanent feature of ISED to do this kind of review. This is something I've never seen before. And then the third element is the very fundamental review of the SR&ED tax credit program, about 3 billion annually. Finally, the third element in terms of a new approach is, it's interesting, as you all have noticed, that the superclusters have to compete against each other for funding. So they don't automatically just get funding in total as they were before and allocated and split, roughly evenly in terms of their original funding. They're going to have to show and compete against each other to be able to get it. And I have no doubt that this concept will very likely be applied in terms of other funding initiatives and funding programs. So to me, this again signals this change from the new sheriff in town in terms of a different kind of approach. And we were sensitive to that as we then began to look in detail at the budget provision. Finally, the last slide, Omer. The question is the approach that has been taken, is it going to be enough? If you can draw the linkages, Omer, in that slide. For us, the central, and I think our answer to that is no, we don't think that this is going to be enough. What we were looking for, and we think is absolutely critical, is to make the economic strategy tables permanent. There has been some extraordinarily good work done by the 9 economic strategy tables and then integrated into one report by Monique Leroux from the Industry Strategy Council that I found to be particularly effective in looking at how to really develop industrial strategy in Canada. But the core element to me is to make these groups permanent. You can't just go from one budget to another looking at the challenges facing different economic sectors. You have to have an ongoing month-by-month relationship between government, academic community, and centrally the business community in terms of looking at these challenges. I mean, just look at the challenge, the changes have been made in the last, 6 or 7 months in terms of the invasion of Ukraine and the impact that has had in terms of so many issues. So a permanent body is needed. And what would the body look at? Number one is industrial strategy, but a net zero industrial strategy. I think we need to integrate the GHG emission reduction, the clean part of clean growth, right into the heart of industrial strategy. That then needs to be linked to a trade strategy. And as you know, we need to look at growing the economy so that we can get the resources and the money that we need to pay for the variety of social programs that we have. And I'm sure a variety of programs that will have to deal with inflation. This then becomes the central piece in terms of integrating our innovation strategy. So again, these three need to be linked together. And of course, we totally recognize the kind of skill sets that we're going to need from our academic partners from universities and the community colleges to be able to make these other three components of the strategy work together effectively. So that's the overall kind of approach that I kind of saw in terms of this and guided the analysis that Omer is going to take us through in terms of the details of the budget. Thank you. Omer.
Thanks, Dave. Let's dive into Budget 2022 context. Mentioned major focus areas of the budget are the affordable housing at large, but focus more on the mitigation side, productivity and innovation as the third. And Minister Freeland refers to these three key priorities as pillars. So I'll go into each one of these at some level of detail. And we also noticed that defense and security and indigenous reconciliation are other key focuses of the budget. On the first pillar, housing affordability, so the issue on the left-hand side, we try to understand, what's going on in this ecosystem is such a big deal. And it's just the houses are getting worse and worse to afford in terms of buying across the economy. So when we look at National Bank of Canada, its affordability worsened at a faster rate more than in the last 26 years. So that's one key problem. The other part of the issue is a lot of our income is going to service a mortgage on a house. So this is higher than the rates that we've seen in mid-1990s. It's up to 50% of all median income of a Canadian household. Then looking at the surge of the price of a house, and that surge is more than 50% over the last 2 years. And we don't have enough houses. So there's an issue with housing supply in terms of the types of houses Canadians want to buy. So there's a supply and demand issue in that as well. So the budget is allocating a lot of money to this field, over 10 billion over 6 years. There's actually a dedicated chapter on this entire housing affordability issue. Besides that chapter, there's an additional $4 billion for indigenous housing. So it takes us to about $14 billion of investments into housing affordability. So that's pillar one. On pillar two, which is the climate change, the key issue is that in terms of our performance with the gas emissions, over the sort of 30-year period since 1990s, there's not much improvement. Except for last year, because of COVID, greenhouse gas emissions decreased, but it is likely to increase back up because of the reopening of the economy and increased transportation and all that is all starting to emerge. And the key issue in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions that we need to really look more carefully for green transition over time is the two largest sectors contributing to it. So there's the oil and gas sector and transport sector, and that contribute to about 52% of total emissions. And there's the building sector, electricity, heavy industry, and so on. From the budget's investment point of view, we found out 25 environmental measures looking at this area, totaling $17.5 billion. And there is the emissions reductions plan. So that came out earlier than the budget, looking at our plan for 2030, and I have a few slides for that. And the budget has additional announcements that are complementing to that plan. And that plan included $9 billion of new spending. So the one key message that I want to leave with you is that the measures seem to have focused on the mitigation side. About 3/4 of the measures are looking at the climate change mitigation. There's some investments into adaptation as well, looking at the impacts that we cannot actually reverse. So how do we adapt to those changes that is coming to impact Canadians? And there is also a bulk of sort of investments into the conservation and recreational area in terms of environmental measures. This is one of the Sankey diagrams that we developed looking at the 2030 emissions reduction plan. So it has a clear, I think, articulation of where are we today in terms of the emissions, where do we want to be by 2030, and how do we get there? So the plan identifies 104 initiatives that based on our count and analysis. And these initiatives are targeting 11 impact areas. So oil and gas, transportation, buildings, heavy industry, and all are part of the plan. And it also has targets for each of these impact areas to reduce their emissions. And there are key initiatives to support each sector. So for oil and gas, 2. Investment tax credit for carbon storage utilization, carbon capture, storage, and utilization. So that seems to be the dominant item for that sector. For transportation, we've noted there is zero emission vehicles seem to have received a lot of investments. And there are a lot of other examples that we'll get into further detail per sector. The third pillar that the Minister Freeland refers to as the Achilles heel of the Canadian economy is productivity and innovation. She refers to how Canadians are the best educated in the OECD and how our scientists win Nobel Prizes and cities are creating in urban centers high-paying technology jobs. However, we are falling behind in terms of economic productivity. And it really matters to have that competitive edge in the global landscape and have impact on our standard of living, which is high these days, but in the future, for the long run, we have to make sure that it is the case going forward. A little bit of a detail, I'll get into that productivity and innovation, which is actually a fairly complicated topic. But this is the tree that is used extensively by central agencies, including finance department, looking at the productivity file. The growth in the sector depends on key 3 activities, looking at people, physical capital, and innovation, what is referred to as multi-factor productivity. So we're not going to get into that detail, but in summary, the key pillar for generating the productivity is the multi-factor productivity or innovation, where the people and physical capital and resources are combined to generate new products, services, business processes, marketing methods, organizational forms, and so on. So it is very broad in terms of what we're trying to achieve using innovation. It's not only invention, but it's also adopting technologies for making our businesses more productive, generating more value, making more profits, and so on, and becoming more competitive. So that's going to be the key pillar in terms of achieving this pillar going forward. Just one illustration of a graphic that is from the budget itself is an issue of long-term economic growth. So it is noted that in terms of the per capita GDP growth from 2020 to 2060, Canada is one of the lowest among the OECD members. So this is one of the key issues and what the Pillar 3 is trying to address. One illustration looking at the waves that are right behind us, looking at inflation, which reached about 6.7% in March 2020. So it is very high. Geopolitical conflicts, as you're all aware, the issues going on, the war in Ukraine, very big focus, and it will have implications throughout our economy here. And climate change, as they refer to in great focus and detail. It is a big challenge, and we have to make sure we have to get to the shore before these waves hit us. And broadly looking at global risks, and this is an assessment from World Economic Forum, environmental risks really dominate the space, and societal risks as another one that emerge. And the top risks are really environmental in that matter. So it is a huge challenge. We have a lot of initiatives and investments, and a lot of departments involved in solving that problem. So it is going to be very important to have a solid implementation plan to make sure that we address these risks effectively. And there's an assessment of risks, societal risks, and environmental risks. And I think there's a lot that we can do as a country to address these risks going forward. terms of the context of the budget, in comparison to other budgets that were announced in the past, Budget 2021 was the largest one in the Canadian history. And the one before was our COVID-19 response. As you can see in the sort of middle right side of the graphic, it amounted to a huge number of billions of dollars, 345, and obviously led to a significant increase in public debt. So this budget now is looking at $15.4 billion over 2 years. We always look at the next 2 years upcoming in terms of our analysis to first focus on what will be the implementation immediately. So that's the money that is allocated for that. And it is also targeting significantly to get revenues back into the government purse from different tax measures and so on. But this is the net impact. It is new money being allocated for the 8 chapters in the budget. So looking at those 8 chapters, the first one, the highest one, is clean air and a strong economy. So that's $12.45 billion, primarily focused on the economic expenditures. Then moving forward on reconciliation is the second biggest one. That's primarily social oriented. And we have also 2 chapters looking at both social and economic side of things. There's housing affordability that speaks to both. Similarly, on the creating jobs and leadership in terms of Canadian position globally, which is focused a bit on the geopolitical issues and defense expenditures, is ranking in the middle of the pack. I think most important from a research development innovation point of view is chapter 2. So that is focusing on growing and making a strong, resilient economy in Canada. So that's the focus of our budget presentation going forward. So we delved into that aspect of the budget in more detail. How about the 10 largest programs of the budget? So in terms of single programs, the top one is reinforcing our defense priorities. So that's $6 billion. Then there are about 4 initiatives looking at the social side. So dental care is one of them, supporting First Nations children and all. And the first economic initiative looking at growth of the economy is the investment tax credit. So that $2.6 billion is the biggest program that we see in that topic. And environmentally, switching to zero emission vehicles and making them more affordable is the largest program from the environmental point of view. Let's delve into the R&D innovation performance here, starting with the global context. In 2021, in US dollars, globally, there were about $2.23 trillion of new knowledge being produced. So in that bigger picture, Canada is a very small player. We contribute about 1.4% of global investments in R&D, or about $32 billion of USD, or 40 billion in Canadian. And in that landscape, I think one of the lenses that we need to wear is to access to the 98.6% of the new knowledge, the remaining new knowledge that other countries create to meet Canadians' needs and also respond to global challenges. However, when we look at our strategies trying to reverse this trend of declining Canadian research and development initiatives as a percentage of GDP, we have about $23 billion of a gap to meet an average OECD country's performance. So this is a significant issue as we also look at the productivity file and increasing investments into this field to make firms more competitive. It is not a good trend, so we need to reverse that. I think there are some investments in the budget that are trying to have impact towards that direction, but the gap is very wide to fill at the moment. Why is Canada spinning in the wrong direction? So we look at the OECD competitors and their performance, looking at R&D and how much they spend on that. And there's almost 20% of growth in their approach to that over the last 10 years. whereas we have declined our R&D expenditures about 15%. So this is, again, a question to perhaps discuss as a team. In the context of the innovation file, one of the key metrics that we look at is Global Innovation Index. And this is assessment from 2021. We actually improved our input ranking. So we are 8th in terms of inputs to the ecosystem, but we are not ranking well in terms of outputs of the innovation ecosystem. And I think this is one of the parts of the Achilles heel that Minister Freeland is referring to. We need to be able to turn our innovation inputs into outputs more effectively as we also close this gap. Major flows. So there are 8 flows of R&D funding in Canada, sources of funding: federal government, higher education, provincial, private, not-for-profits, foreign, and business. And there are 4 key performance of R&D. Federal government itself, internally, higher education, provinces to some level, and business. When we look at these key sources and performers, the business sector and higher education sector emerges as really the new knowledge creators. So it is important to keep in mind as a context as we look at different flows and the impact of budget on this ecosystem. How do we actually perform our R&D? Where does this occur? So when we look at the total picture of 40 billion I just showed you, 41% of that is performed within the higher education sector. So this is in contrast to the OECD average of 17%. There is an imbalance in terms of, if we were to benchmark that, it's an outlier. Canada is an outlier for that realm. And reversely, on the business side, the private sector average is 71% in terms of expenditures for R&D, business expenditures on R&D. And for the Canadian case, it's 51%. So this is an interesting picture to look at and reflect on. An assessment by ISED, a government department looking at innovation, science, and economic development. We need to have an immediate and targeted action and build on our strengths. We need to address these key gaps and weaknesses along the innovation continuum. And we need to drive growth. Otherwise, we will further fall behind and our high quality of life will be at risk. This is another quote from Deputy Minister of ISED, John Nubley, and looking at really that competitive race of technology and innovation globally, and how we need to look at the demand side of supports as well as much as the supply side, because he makes it very clear that we have looked at supports for science and universities, and he acknowledges that that may not be working. And we need to look at that from a competitive lens. And building on that, Peter Nicholson, who is very well established in our ecosystem, is looking at diffusion of innovation to and within Canada, and how we also need to really focus on intensively on technology adoption by small and medium-sized businesses in order to make them more competitive, more productive, and producing that the ecosystem needs. Let's look at the investments. So one of the things we do every year is looking at what are the key research initiatives and what are the key innovation initiatives. And this is over sort of a 5-year period. One of the trends in that matter that we notice is that the file seems to have shifted towards innovation. The key research file, the biggest one that we find, is $160 million for supporting post-secondary institutions in building capacity in order to protect research. And that's one of the issues that came up in terms of the Canadian IP and how we need to protect it. So there's in that sort of stroke an investment that seems to be the biggest initiative for the research side. Besides that, federal granting councils have received 41 and 38 respectively for supporting Blacks and researchers and some research chairs in terms of Canada Excellence Research Chairs program in STEM fields. But when you look at that from the sort of the innovation side of things, they are quite small. It's another thing that we noted. And the biggest initiative for innovation that we find is the Canadian critical mineral strategy. And I think that's going to be key at $1.2 billion. And specifically for our key focus here, and to build value chains and link that into global markets. Secondly, $1 billion for creating an innovation and investment agency. And that's to boost sectoral growth generally, but also including defense. So, and we are yet to see more about that going forward, new announcements. So this is a bit of a picture of that in a summary form. Here's another way to look at the initiatives, and the key one that we noted looking at R&D innovation is that World Leading Canada Growth Fund. And Dave can allude to this more later. The net fiscal impact of this initiative is $1.5 billion, but it is aiming to have capitalization up to $15 billion. So this is a significant policy sign and an initiative towards achieving the net zero targets, as we also look at growing the economy. Secondly, mentioned the new investment and innovation agency and agriculture to fight climate change and all. So the top 5 are marked in red. Another quick point to make is the cybersecurity file. It's the 4th biggest. And we have quite a lot of money for that investment in comparison to previous year's budget that we saw. It's almost coming up to $1 billion. And it is to really look at that cyber risks, which is intensifying in last years. I think the key question here is, can the government deliver? We have a lot of results to achieve. So economic results is one bucket, environmental is another, and there's a social equity and diversity results. And there are some targets that are specified, like increasing our per capita GDP by adding another $4,000 to the annual income of a median family with children by 2030. So it's very specific in that realm. So we need to look at a plan to achieve that, and what are going to be the key economic growth generators within the economy to be able to fuel that increase for everyone in Canada. For environmentally, again, there are key targets, as we also mentioned, ERP plan, and there are also key social and equity and diversity results which are very welcome and much of a focus of government. Let's look at the impact on federal government departments. So the biggest one is mentioned, the $6 billion one, and then there's the healthcare, dental care for Health Canada. CMHC seem to have received rapid housing related acceleration of housing types of investments that came up very strongly and clearly in terms of the top initiatives, the biggest items impacting federal departments. ECCC, again, looking at the low carbon economy fund, and some also investment for COVID. Still, it's not completely gone, although the focus seemed to have shifted away from COVID. And also for global affairs, there's global health security priorities and looking at infectious diseases and so on in also the context of COVID. More additional initiatives impacting, so it's just continuation of that. I think 2 things to note. We noticed NRCan seems to have received a lot of files to look at ZEV charging, the electric vehicle infrastructure. There is the deep retrofit initiative. There's green building strategy. There is another one looking at the critical mineral value chains. As mentioned, NRCan is going to have an important role along with NRC. And the other, I think, very important measure that will impact all departments is a strategic policy review. And it is going to be led by Treasury Board. And the goal is to save 6 + 3 annually going forward. So about $9 billion from the operations of the government and investments and so on. Here's a picture of Canadian science-based departments and agencies in the context of our review of the governments. And NRC comes out very clearly in terms of who does research within the federal government, intramural R&D. The top one comes NRC, then Agriculture Canada, then NRCan, then there's the DND, ECCC, and other departments. When we add to this list the extramural R&D funders, who are the granting councils, the picture looks like this. And we have a total of $8.5 billion of investments from this group, which is significant as we also go towards achieving the productivity goals. It will be important to look at their investments as well. Here's a tree diagram of the key federal programs supporting the ecosystem. So SIF is number one, based on the main estimates of Finance Department, 2023, so this fiscal year. Second, third are NSERC and CIHR in terms of their total budgets. NRC, well, before that there's SHRC, and then NRC, excluding IRAP, is still nearly $1 billion. And CFI, and then NRC IRAP is major innovation clusters, super clusters initiative, and so on. And MyTax is also there within the picture of the key programs supporting the ecosystem. Provincial governments, just wanting to note here in terms of the impact, we noticed $2 billion to top up the Canada Health transfer. And this is very small in terms of the need. I think the provinces need to be able to respond to their growing health-related initiatives and expenses and debt as well. And the budget did not include a renegotiation of these health transfers with provinces in terms of assisting the post-COVID economic recovery. For the higher education sector, just to emphasize their importance, it is a small portion of the Canadian economy, but it produces the talent for every aspect of the economy, all economic activity. So this is just to emphasize really the importance of that. When we look at the impact of budget on the higher education sector, we notice $309 million targeting the sector, and $160 million is for the protection of the Canadian research. But I think one of the maybe less spoken parts is the intellectual property investment, which is almost $100 million. And 48 million of that, or half of that, is dedicated to a new national lab-to-market platform. So this is a new initiative, and it's a very interesting initiative from a linking the higher education sector to the private sector type of initiative and looking at that commercialization aspect. Here are two key quotes that we found from the Universities Canada and Colleges and Institutes Canada, looking at their views on the budget. From the university side, one thing that seems to have emerged as a theme is the discovery research part, and how that wasn't really a face of the budget or focus of the budget. And from the colleges side, I think there's a bit of a key role that they mentioned they could play in terms of achieving these objectives, pumping up the talent and stimulating the growth, fostering innovation, helping achieve the net zero emissions, and so on, as they also focus on applied research and growing the numbers for the economy. Here's an interesting trend as well. They alluded to this 10.6 million, not 106, that would be a lot of money, to assess the performance of the post-secondary institutions, to generate commercial outcomes from publicly funded knowledge. So this is a very, very interesting and important trend to look at, well, what are we producing from publicly funded research? Are they generating value for the Canadians that are intended to do? Implications for the business. From a general sort of the nature of the economy perspective, here's a graphic that shows how service-producing sectors are dominant in the economy. Manufacturing, construction, energy, agriculture, mining, and probably double that, you would still not get that right top bubble that is looking at producing sectors. And almost 80% of Canadians are in service-producing sectors. So generation of that wealth, 70% of the GDP is coming from service-producing sectors. So I think one thing to note here is to look at that sector a bit closer as we try to generate the wealth. Here's a picture on the R&D performance landscape. Maybe to some level, contrary to many, R&D investments from the business sector have actually increased last year despite COVID. So pharmaceutical sector led that growth, then IT sectors were the second one. These were the most R&D intensive sectors. And the I think key message here is to look at that green transition, because private sector will be very important actor in terms of lead. Will these kinds of investments be enough for achieving those results? Impact on the business sector, CCUS is the biggest, largest program, then the Canada Growth Fund, and some reinforcement to Canada Revenue Agency were also made to look at the business sector, the Innovation Investment Agency, agriculture to fight climate change. So there's investments into that. So these are the key programs supporting the business sector. And in addition, there's a lot of focus on the talent, bringing new workers to Canada. So there's $4 billion for measures, in measures for skills and jobs. So this is very encouraging to see. Let's look at the implications for responding to global threats and global markets. I think we notice we are in a very dangerous world. Just a little story we noticed in our offices the day before that someone tried to get into the office at 2 a.m. in the morning, break into the office. They couldn't, so we were lucky enough to have everything protected. We had the security systems and all here. But now there's a heightened pressure that we feel. Normally, we weren't really seeing that. So globally as well, sometimes these kinds of events really spur the need to refocus some of our attention to look at the competitive advantage, competitive landscape, and finding our position into that place. Maybe think about increasing the Canadian fence to build better walls to protect the economy and all. So for that matter, the budget has investments into defense. I'll go very quickly over these slides. $6 billion into that. It's just a down payment is what we see. It actually misses the mark from a 2% GDP point of view, and I'll get into that in the next slide. Support for Ukraine, and then the renewing our rapid response mechanism. So there's some investments for global affairs there, and protecting democracy. It's a summary slide on how we could only get to 1.5% of the GDP with this new investment, but it is below the 2% of the NATO target. Looking at cybersecurity, as mentioned, a key file focus for your information. And from the global market point of view, here are our trading partners. There's China, India, EU, USA, Mexico. And it's important to look at these markets from how to sell Canadian goods and services more effectively into these markets, how they get better access. From the budget's investment point of view, again, we see that there's a lack of significant international trade initiatives. So we should be taking advantage of these opportunities. There's focus more on the internal trade side. So National Trade Corridors Fund, that's the biggest initiative. And there are also supply chain related investments and also semiconductors. So those ones are good to see, but very, very small focus on the international trade aspect. And our trade balance is weakening. So that's import-export balance. And we are in the negative. And it is a big contributor to our ongoing current account deficit. US market, again, 76% of our exports go to the US market. So we need to look at diversification of that. There's China, European Union, UK, and Asian markets in general. Product diversification is another way, another opportunity I think we need to look at as countries commit to increasing ambitious environmental net zero emissions targets. So how will we pivot our largest exports, which is energy exports? And there's also motor vehicles and parts that are susceptible to energy-related changes. Here is the service exports picture. So they are growing globally. So Canadian also services exports are growing. So that's another market that we need to have a look at more closely to grow. And there are market opportunities as well. This is just one of them from International Energy Agency, looking at the Asia Pacific markets and batteries as well that the world needs. Yeah, so for the summary part of our presentation, just want to look at that strategy and how you need to look at the gap and how we need to also look at effectively collaborating between governments and private sector and academia. So this is Michael Sabia is one of the deputies of the new chef in town, as Dave mentioned. So it's time to step up from others to help out the government, because it's really hard for the government to tackle with all the issues alone. So to effectively respond that, I think it's very important that we have mechanisms that allow us to have dialogue on an ongoing basis and forum for innovation strategy development. And one of them is the economic strategy tables that we think could work. And there are 9 of them. I think there's going. So here is a picture that I think a path could provide a path towards net zero. And it is about creating these collaborative structures to embrace our interdependence, looking at net zero industrial strategy, as net zero being an essential.
Omer, can you hear us? I think you had internet.
So I'll stop here.
Okay, that's no problem. That's good. We couldn't hear the last 15 seconds, but that's okay. And so thank you, David, first, and especially Omer, for this very comprehensive analysis of the budget. There is so much to absorb, and obviously we have already received so many questions. I want to ask our office to first, before getting to questions, to launch the first poll. This is the demographic poll. This is for the purpose of CSBC to know our audience and improve in future. I really appreciate if you take 15 seconds or 10 seconds to answer this poll, which is just launched by my colleagues. I appreciate that. And also I want to thank the CSBC team members who helped with the organization of this symposium: Wendy Zhu, Soha Sani, Bailey Smith, Victor Latoki, Trudy Dong, and the entire CSBC volunteer event planning team. And please ask your questions by adding them into the question box, not in the chat line. I saw some conversation in the chat line, which is great for the purpose of brainstorming, but the questions should be posted into the question box. And I really appreciate if David and Omer to perhaps summarize the answer so that we get to as many questions as possible. So having said that, let's go to the first question, which is question for David. What do you think is the rationale behind developing independent organizations? Is this a sign of lack of trust in government departments?
Interesting question. First of all, Matt, I really don't know. I think there's a recognition, and you saw actually the statement by Sabia that from 2018 that governments are having a real challenge dealing with these very, very complex issues. When you compound that with the little analysis I went through in terms of the state of the public service today, coming out of COVID, uncertain about the future of their kids and going to school, a bit of a burnout, and then the overload of initiatives that they're asked to deal with, the 645 commitments that have been made in mandate letters, the compounding of that in terms of the expenditure reduction program, which was quite major in a budget, as well as delivering their A-base activity. This puts a huge burden on government. As one illustration of the challenge, there's a new green housing program, and there was an analysis done, I believe it was a Globe and Mail article, that showed of the 180,000 people that had asked for assistance from that program, after about 7 or 8 months, only 123 had received any benefit. I know this personally in terms of my son and his wife have applied for the program back in July and still do not have any kind of a satisfactory response. So there's an overburdening of the public service. And the issue then is, are there ways that we can actually try and provide service to Canadians without necessarily doing it through the public service? And at one time, as you know, in Finance Canada, we created a whole series of not-for-profits this is going another step then of actually creating organizations that are even more distanced from governments to try and deliver these services to Canadians. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, David. The next question by Osmo Ruiz. She would like to know your thoughts on that 9 billion program cuts. Which programs do you think would be most be susceptible to this and why? And is this helpful kind of method for spurring innovation?
Was that question directed at me? Sorry, Meredith?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, there really are no details in the budget about the 9 million. One is very clearly focused on strategic reviews, but that could really apply to anything. I think what it does show is with increasing inflation affecting so many people, including government programs, with the challenges that we're seeing globally in terms of supply chains and reassessing what we need to do in Canada as opposed to what we do abroad, with some of the points that Omer made about some of the elements have not been funded yet, even through this budget. So that whole question of health transfers has not really been funded. To my absolute shock, I was stunned to surprise that we do not have an adaptation strategy for climate change. That is much more real than dealing with mitigation. You have to deal with both. There's no question about that. But as we saw from BC in terms of the flooding, in terms of the heat wave, there was one town in BC that reached for a week a temperature of, was it 47.6 degrees? I mean, the impact like that, Canadians understand. The issue is we haven't looked at how we need to fund that. And so that's going to be a challenge. Put all those, pressures together, Meredith, you can see the need to look at all federal programming to see whether it's essential. One of the things that I would advise is you go back and you have a look at Jocelyn Burgon was a clerk of the Privy Council who led a fundamental review of programming. NELCAP was involved in that. And they had a series of 5 or 6 tests in terms of whether a program would survive or not. I would recommend people go back and have a look at those 6 very basic questions. For example, just very quickly, is it a federal area of responsibility or is it a provincial area of responsibility? To me, so many of the programs I see, the federal government funding, are really areas of provincial responsibility. So I could see that a number of those might be susceptible to review and cutbacks.
Thank you, David. And Omer, there is a question regarding the slide number 42, asking if all R&D funders, with the exception of NRC IRAP, work with public education system or they also work with private sector. If they do, could you identify which ones, and not necessarily referring to the tax rebate program?
So slide 42, 42.
42, sorry, here is mentioned 42.
42. You can hear me well, right? I think I had some internet issues.
Yes, we can hear you well now. That's good.
Okay, that's great. So we're looking at slide 42. We have the top programs. There's SIF program, there's NSERC, CIHR, SHERC, NRC, excluding IRAP, there's CFI, NRC, IRAP, and all. I think the SIF program is looking at the industry side. I think the question is around whether they work with private sector, right? Let me see the question again. Yes, SIF program is primarily supporting individual firms, is what we see. So I think there's about 75 firms. I mean, the number is around that ballpark. Don't quote me for the exact number. And there are some, I think, growing interest in terms of supporting networks and clusters through the SIF program. So I think that's the latter streams, stream 4 and 5. And some organizations have been funded through that stream, but it's only a handful, I would say, or maximum 2 hands. So that's a growing, perhaps, focus in terms of looking at how do we support maybe clusters and larger pots of firms as opposed to one-on-one relationships. For the second, third, and fourth largest programs, I think they have components that look at private sector, but they primarily support research at universities, and some of them do have programs in the colleges as well. But it's, again, if you look at it as a tree diagram, you will see most of that going into the university research from those three preceding top programs. And NRC has research centers internally that does intramural R&D, also collaborates with industry. So there are some challenge programs, for example, targeting that. For NRC IRAP, the focus is absolutely on the business support. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. That was very comprehensive. Thank you. Next question is by Novina Robinson for David. And she's asking, can you speculate a bit on what message did the budgets send to IRAP for not receiving new annual funds, something that has almost been de rigueur? What is the message to NRC after all the fiascos of things that, Medicago, etc.?
Yeah, I wouldn't read too much into the, not saying anything specifically for IRAP at this time. I think that would be, point number one. What is of related interest, though, is there's one paragraph in the budget that does talk about, in the same grouping, the new innovation fund and the potential impact in terms of the National Research Council. Now, what I'm not sure of is whether those two are being very specifically related. In other words, will there be a direct link between the National Research Council and this new innovation body? I did notice that the NRC had its legislation amended to give it more flexibility in terms of creating other corporations. But again, I wouldn't read too much into that. That may have been done for another purpose, for example. The other one is that IRAP, as Nabina, I'm sure knows, has received a huge amount of money over the last, 3-4 years. I mean, offhand, I'm going to say it's probably as much as $450, maybe even $500 million for a variety of purposes. So it really has been strengthened. One of the issues for me, though, in terms of IRAP is primarily it focuses on assisting firms on a one-off basis. What we're finding in relation to the two organizations referred to in the budget, Techies, which is now called Finland Business, and then the Israeli Innovation Authority, very often they will fund a consortia. They will go out and they will say, look, you guys organize yourself into a consortia. We will then do collective research or collective development, pre-development of technology that you all can use. So it's a different kind of collective approach as opposed to a one-off approach. And to me, there may be a bit of a hint about it going in that direction.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question for any of you who would like to take it. Are you concerned about the lack of investment in talent trained by the higher education sector outside of these specific investments to Black researchers, despite many calls to do so, including the discussions by Standing Committee on Science and Research? The budget did not include any global increase in the funding to scholarships, fellowships. The value of these awards has stagnated for nearly 2 decades. This creates a significant barrier to entry. Any comment on that from any of you?
Well, Omer, I'll make just a couple of general comments. As Omer described, Canada is not even remotely in the ballpark of our OECD countries, the 38 of them. And you've got some very, very small economies there investing much more in research and development. So there's a issue number one is how much in total are you investing in research and development? Now, you'll also notice from the data that Omer put up that Canada, I think, actually invests about 41% of its total R&D in higher academic institutions. Whereas what was the OECD average? Omer, 17%, something like that. So
17, yeah.
Yeah, we actually overinvest in terms of the investments. That's not to say you cut back at all. Obviously, the other point we're making is that higher education sector feeds into all other sectors of the Canadian economy in terms of the talent that we meet. So we want to make sure that we have these great graduates that are really coming out. I think, though, that there is a message in the budget about not the talent so much as the research that is being done. It's kind of like that, remember that film, Show Me the Money, or the line from that film? The fact that there's going to be a very specific, and there's a budget reference, this $10.6 million in ISED to review federally funded R&D, particularly from universities, to see, well, how is that new knowledge leading to commercialization? To me, that's a warning shot over the bow. I would pay attention to that in terms of trying to find out what are the implications of that, who's going to be, running that kind of thing, how might it affect the university system, and so on.
Thank you. Any additional comment from you, Omer? Or we can go to the next question.
We can go to the next one. I think David covered.
Thank you. So I'm hoping that we can cover more questions. Do we have the information? This is for anyone who would like to take it. Do we have any information on the global budget of each research council to know if globally it was increased or decreased? It looks like the government only gave the numbers on the new investments, but not updates of the total budget of each agency or council, if there is any information on that.
Well, this, it's a very good question. If you're looking at the combined support for NSERC, SHRC, and CIHR of being roughly $3 billion, including the operating costs of research, that fund that is put through SHRC. And if you're looking at inflation at 6 or 7% per year, then you would have to stay even, an increase on their budgets, of their A-base budgets, of about $210 million, just to stay even. They did get some money, as you know, for some very specific areas, but that doesn't hit the A-base. That is targeted to very specific outcomes. So the questioner is absolutely right. And just as an aside, it has always astonished me over the past 10 years, because I was involved in it. There's a little formula you have in terms of NSERC, SHRC, and CIHR. That very often they would get an amount of money and think, oh, this is fantastic, this is great. It wasn't causing, it wasn't even meeting their inflationary costs. They were just, slight decreases every year. So I think the question is a good one. And as far as I can see, in effect, they've been cut.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask one more question. Before that, I want to ask my colleagues to launch the feedback poll. For participants, we're going to ask one more question, and with that, we're going to return at 1:30. The question is from Dr. Mallet from Colton University, and she's asking that one of the criticism of conventional measures of productivity and economic growth is that current ways of measuring growth, such as reliant on continued consumption, cause various social and environmental problems. So rather than pouring money into the next breakthrough technology on climate, such as carbon capture utilizations and storage and hydrogen, wouldn't it be better to target issues such as how we measure growth, design our cities, etc.? And she mentioned that she has worked in this, just for the disclosure. Any comment on that?
Omer, let me just give an answer, and then I'll turn it over to you. I think the questioner is absolutely right. GDP should not be the measure that we're using in terms of measuring the growth of an economy within a society. And what was interesting, Meredith, is last year there was a specific reference in the budget to exploring a different way of looking at growth. It was built after some work done in New Zealand, in Scotland, and several other jurisdictions. I inquired about this recently and found out, unfortunately, this has been taken out of the Department of Finance and given to Treasury Board, where I would imagine it'll be lost. The fact that it was being initiated, and by the way, there's a paper that you can get that explored this in some detail by Department of Finance, I thought was one of the best measures that I personally had ever seen, because I think we do need different ways of looking at what is a quality of life. I mean, that's what you're trying to improve, not just GDP per capita. So I think that question is an excellent one, and I hope people try and force this government to get back on that path of trying to develop these concepts further. Omer?
If you can hear me well, I just lost the connection for a bit. But yes, quality of life framework is one of the things that we noticed in the last budget. That was a really good indication of not just looking at GDP per capita as the gold standard of economic growth, but looking at the standard of living and people's life from other types of indicators point of view. So that includes the social and environmental aspects that the questioner alluded to, absolutely. And I think one of the things to keep in mind, a little bit going back to the clean growth file, is there is still going to be consumption, and it is going to fuel the growth of economies globally. So how do we make sure that we have products and services that are environmentally friendly, and when consumed doesn't create such problems? And I think that really speaks back to the importance of clean growth as an agenda, because I think some of the growth that we have generated, especially after Second World War, has not been clean, and that will have to change, and that transition will have to occur. And hopefully we will end up having some sort of consumption growth that is not generating such unintended consequences.
Thank you very much. With that, Omer and Dave, I want to thank you for this comprehensive analysis. There were so many other questions, but we ran over time, actually 5 minutes over time. The next session will start in 10 minutes at 1:30. On the same Zoom link. You don't have to go anywhere. The panel of academia, we have Dr. Sharmin Dean, Vice President, Research, University of Waterloo, Dr. Malcolm Campbell, Vice President, Research, University of Guelph, Dr. Baljit Singh, Vice President, Research, University of Saskatchewan, moderated by Dr. Ariane Obalijoro, Director of Future Health Global Hub and Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age. We'll see you in almost 10 minutes, and thank you very much once again to our presenters.
Thank you, Mehrdad. Take care.
Thank you.